Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Braden Knudsen. I'll be your host for this webinar today. Before we start, feel free to answer some of the polls that we have down at the bottom of the screen. We'd love to know how you heard about the webinar and what topics you'd be interested in hearing for next month's webinars. We are currently putting together the October schedule, so that would be really helpful. Also, our next webinar this month will be on Energizing Family History with Find, Take, Teach by Catherine Grant. And that will be on Monday, September 25th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. So we hope you can join us for that one, and it'll be really good. So hope to see you then. Today we'll be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Revolutionary War Records, Patriots to Hessians. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years of experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He is the co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. So as we turn the time over to James, I'd like to remind everybody about the question pod on the right-hand side. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to ask, and we will turn the time over to James.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. Glad to be back here for another BYU Family History Library webinar series. This one we're going to talk about is Revolutionary War Records, Patriots to Hessians. And remind everybody that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. And you can subscribe to our channel and receive notification. Okay, we'll get into this here a little bit now. First, a little bit of history. It's hard to understand this, but the seeds of the revolution between the colonies of the British colonies and Great Britain began as early as 1651. And what happened is that in 1651, Britain began passing what were called the Navigation Acts, that what limited who could land and who could ship goods and services back and forth across the Atlantic to the American colonies. So what happened is, of course, the colonies loved to have get their goods from just about anybody, from the cheapest seller. They would certainly like to get what they wanted rather than what England mandated that they could have. And so that was a big bone of contention for a lot of years between the colonies and England. And one of the products of that, of course, was that there was a tremendously large smuggling operation that was developed in the American colonies to circumvent the laws that had been passed by Great Britain. And then we kind of jump forward in time until we come up to the Molasses Act. And the Molasses Act started a series of acts that were passed by Great Britain, imposing duties on, or taxes, if you want to call it that, on certain commodities. And one of those, which was kind of a staple in the colonies, was molasses. And they passed a law restricting access to molasses and imposing some taxes on that. And then the second thing that happened was a few years later, and you can see that we're getting a little bit closer to the time when the revolution began. And that was the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act provided essentially that anyone who had a public document, any kind of document, had to have a stamp on it. Now, this is interesting because when I first started practicing law, very, very many years ago now, over 40 years ago. One of the requirements for filing documents in the court system in Arizona was that you had to put a document stamp, which was an actual stamp. It was like a postage stamp, that you had to buy these stamps, and buying the stamps was and putting it on the document before it could be filed was essentially a tax. It was a tax on filing documents, and that's basically what the Stamp Act did. Some of these laws were abolished after a period of time, but they began cumulatively over the time period to create an idea of us and them. In other words, the colonies began to think of themselves as a unit, as people who were being oppressed by them, meaning the people who were left over in Great Britain. It didn't, one other thing that added, of course, to this was that during that period of time, you had a lot of people coming to America from other countries, from the Netherlands, from Ireland, and from Germany, and from other countries of the world. And they didn't particularly have any feelings of patriotism or feelings of belonging to the United Kingdom. So they were pretty much anti-English. Particularly the Irish, by the way. The Irish had been conquered by England, and never did quite accept the fact that England could be ruling in their country. So even the early settlers, the ones who had already lived in America for generations, were still dissatisfied with government rule. Well, what happened in 1772 was one of the first armed conflicts. We call it the Boston Massacre. And it was actually a confrontation between some very upset citizens of Boston and the army, and only a very few people, like comparatively few. I mean, one would have probably been outrageous, but there were only a few people killed in the conflict. The next big event that we remember in our Revolutionary War history is the Boston Tea Party. And the reason for that was that England, the United Kingdom, had imposed a tax on tea, and a shipment of tea came in which they would have had to pay the tax on. And a group of colonists, and masquerading as Indians, got together and boarded the ship, and as shown here in this old illustration, threw the tea into the harbor. Some of the people were not really happy with the fact that they lost the tea, but they sympathized with the protest against the Tea Act of 1773. This all culminated in 1775 with armed confrontation between the local militia. Now, militia were local troops who were organized on a colonial basis. Each colony, and usually each city or town, had its own militia. So there's, if you're doing genealogical research into the Revolutionary War, one of the first things you'll discover is that that you really need to know where your person came from, the location where they were enlisted in the Revolutionary War effort, to determine if they were a Continental Army soldier, meaning they were part of the United States, United Colonies Army that had been put together under the auspices of the Continental Congress, or if they were individuals who were enlisted in one of the very, very many different militias. They're all kind of counted together as Revolutionary War soldiers, but finding information on them may be difficult unless you identify specifically where they came from and where they might have enlisted. And that is where we get into a lot of the research efforts that we need to do. But of course, we have the Battle of the Old North Bridge, and that is the start of the war. We also call that the battles of Lexington and Concord, and those were the first military engagements of the war. And it began on April 19th, 1775. So we have a tendency to think of the revolution being identified with the Declaration of Independence, which was in 1776. But the Declaration of Independence was after the war and after some of the conflict had already begun. What happened at the bridge, of course, is that the militia, the local militias, were absolutely outmanned, outnumbered, and outgunned by the British troops, and so they took off into the woods after gathering their casualties and those that were killed, and the British troops began their march back to Boston. And on the way back to their whatever lodgings in Boston, the colonists took to the hills and took to the woods and created sniper fire on them and killed a number more of the soldiers than had been killed in the initial battles. So we have a whole bunch of very important battles, and there isn't time in this presentation to go into each of the battles. Just kind of an aside here, it turned out in my university career at the University of Utah, because I was attending school during the middle of the Vietnam War, and also because I was in the ROTC, or Reserve Officers Training Corps, for all 4 years of my university experience, that I ended up taking more hours of military history than any other subject that I had in the school. Actually, I had more hours on my record of Spanish, but that was just as a result of taking tests from having spoken Spanish. But I really had a tremendous amount of military history taught to me at that time, and I've maintained a little bit of an interest in that. I wouldn't say I'm as absorbed in it as I was at the time I was studying it. These are some of the names of the battles, and the important thing here from a genealogical standpoint in finding your Revolutionary War ancestor is to become aware of these battles, and also to understand that there are lots of histories written about the battles and compilations of the people who fought in the battle, and it's called the order of battle, the people who were participating as soldiers, even those who were support people involved in the wars. And these things are very, very thoroughly and very well documented. Where you get into difficulties in doing research into the Revolutionary War or any military history is when your person was, let's call it, less than stellarly involved in the war, in being an enlisted person, and was an enlisted person, and also if they had a very common name. Those two things are kind of strikes against finding the person and identifying them with any kind of accuracy. So we have Fort Ticonderoga. These are sort of in roughly in chronological order. And then the Battle of Bunker Hill, which really was fought on another hill called Breed's Hill. And they built a nice monument in Boston, across the river, on Bunker Hill, which is why we call it the Battle of Bunker Hill rather than the Battle of Breed's Hill. Okay, so there's lots of complications here sometimes when you get into it. The Battle of Brooklyn, which, yes, is the Brooklyn of New York, that Brooklyn. When we get into the battles of the Revolutionary War, what we find is that they were fought primarily in a very few colonies. There were just, not everybody was totally involved in the war at that time. So it was more of a local kind of effort on the part of different militias and troops that were fighting. Trenton, New Jersey. And then we have the Battle of Princeton, New Jersey. We have the Battle of Brandywine and Germantown, Pennsylvania, and we have Yorktown, Pennsylvania. And now we have one of the interesting things about the entire war, and that is that the British won many of the battles but lost the war. If you go down through these battles and look to see who won, lost, how many soldiers were killed, what was happening, is that the colonists constantly lost the battles. The number is probably 4 to 5. In other words, the British won 4 out of every 5 battles that were fought. And the problem was this, that the colonists lost casualties. Obviously, people were killed, and soldiers were wounded, and there were problems. But then they were home. The British, when they got killed or when they got wounded, they weren't home anymore. They were on contested soil. And the only way that they could replace the army, the soldiers that they were using, was to get them from England. But there was another way, and that is you have to remember one thing about the England at the time of the Revolutionary War, and that is that King George was German. And as a matter of fact, many of the kings of England were directly related to the Germans. They came from the old Holy Roman Empire and the German, the the Habsburg and other lines of royalty in Europe, and they were on the throne in England. And the problem, of course, was that they needed to have soldiers, and they had to stay within their abilities and their budgets of how much money they could get out of the English coffers to support a war. And part of what they did was hire mercenaries. Now we think the term mercenary today is kind of a really bad term, somebody who was hired to go out and shoot and kill or whatever. But back in those days, there were whole countries and whole dukedoms of countries under the rule of one ruler that specialized in supplying troops to other countries. And so one of the effects here at the war was that the British hired a large number of Germans, not all Germans, but they were people who were employed by the Germans army that we call Hessians, and I'll explain about that in a minute. And they fought during the whole war. So we kind of get this concept that the Hessians somehow showed up near the end of the war, and we get this picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware and all that kind of stuff in the middle of the winter with ice and snow and all that. But we don't understand is that they'd been here for all this whole war, that those Germans that were stationed there had been there for the entire time point. So who were the combatants? So we need to find out who's fighting this war. And the first level was there were about 231,000 men in the Continental Army. That meant that over the period of time of the entire battle, of the entire war, that we know that there are about that many, about 231,000 men served in the war in the Continental Army, but only about 48,000 at any given time. So people would come and they would spend a year, they would spend 6 months, they would spend whatever their enlistment was, then they would leave and go home. Some came back, some never did. And this kind of rotation of the servicemen in the war that was going on sort of almost randomly in a sense is probably another big challenge with doing genealogical research with these people, because establishing when and where and how long they served it can be quite a challenge given the records that are in existence. And then it's important also to understand that there are also colonial militias, and those colonial militias were in addition to the Continental Army, as I mentioned at the beginning, and they consisted of about another 145,000 men who were involved in the conflict. Now, we're on the other side, we have the British Army, and they had a total of about 22,000 men. And then, in addition, there were another 25,000 loyalists who aided the British. Now, if you look at these numbers, you'll realize that the British were very much outnumbered. That didn't really have much effect on the battles. the number of men present was nothing compared to the professionalism and training that the British had received from their time in the army. These were professional soldiers who had been trained and taught, as compared to the Continental Army and the militias, which were basically civilian volunteers who knew how to shoot because that's how they got food. Uh, now, um, one of the interesting things to contemplate about the war, the Revolutionary War, is how the tactics, how the battles changed, and how the British fighting essentially what was uh, a localized type civilian army, uh, how that changed the way that battles were fought in the future. What basically gets us up to date to what we call terrorist action, and what we are faced with in our international relations today in the United States is that had its seeds clear back here in the Revolutionary War. That's when the colonists had to use what they had on hand and what weapons, and their ability to essentially vanish um, into the woods or into the area that they were fighting in and mingle in, and were indistinguishable from the combatants, were um, from the general population, is similar to what kind of problems have happened in some of the recent conflicts that the United States has been involved in. The next is the French sent 12,000 soldiers and a large fleet of ships. Now, had the French not sent those soldiers and those ships, it was probably one of the tipping points of the war, that these trained and seasoned soldiers from France, with their naval support, were able to support the revolution. Now, here's where we get the number. There were more German mercenaries or Hessians that served along with the British than all the British in the army. There were about 30,000 German mercenaries that served with the British. So when you added in the 22,000 trained British soldiers and the 30,000 German mercenaries or Hessians, then you had a sizable number of combatants that could basically move and fight battles in different areas. And you can begin to see why the colonists would have lost so many battles in the war. And it was basically became a war of attrition. The war was, you could, to see how long the colonists could hold out. They were sitting on their own country, as opposed to the British, who had a long supply line across the Atlantic. So, what are the records that we have from the war? Where do we go to find out if one of our ancestors participated in the Revolutionary War? There's quite a bit of genealogical prestige, I think, on a part of a lot of people to say that one of their ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. In fact, we have some very formal organizations like the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Sons of the American Revolution that celebrate their ancestry and their connection to the Revolutionary War veterans. So we need to know what kind of records we have available, and as the case with most military records, the basic records are called compiled service records. Okay, these are the records that were kept when the soldiers enlisted in the Army and as they participated in the Army from day to day, and were either transferred or had orders or were detailed into different units, or had any kind of other activity that would have been involved with their service in the Army. And these compiled service records were basically kept for all of those who participated. And then after the war was over, the United States government began the process of, say, paying for these people. Okay, so what happened is one of the incentives, of course, for getting troops to fight was to say, we'll pay you. we'll actually pay you money and we'll provide some benefits to you for coming and serving in the Army. And those pension applications and pension payment records are extensive and are available. They've kind of limited. They're becoming a little more available. Military records are slowly becoming more available, but it didn't rule out the possibility that if you want to do some really serious research into military records, you're going to have to go where the records were kept. And that's generally in the United States from the basis of the Revolutionary War. It's the individual states, the colonies, the original colonies, their military records, which are gathered in different places throughout the different states that participated in the Revolutionary War, and in the National Archives. So we're going to kind of look at that in a minute about how we get to those. Now, the last one's big category of records was the bounty land records. Now, the bounty land records were records that were where the government agreed to pay the individuals who participated. Once the United States government was constituted in approximately 1782, when the Constitution was ratified by all of the different colonies, then the legislature could begin to lay claim to the land that was not claimed by the colonies. So we call that the federal land. So the federal land was the land that was not part of the colonies. Of course, the United States government, began acquiring additional lands fairly quickly. And those lands started with Ohio, the west side of the Ohio River, and went and westward, and then in some other of the areas that were even involved in some of the colonial lands where the government maintained ownership of the property, which, by the way, until they bought the Louisiana Purchase and started adding large tracts of land, really didn't amount to much. But the government, the United States government, recognizing that it had a debt to the soldiers, but also recognizing that there was no money in the treasury to pay the soldiers, agreed to pay them by giving them land. And so each level of person in their enlistment and whether they were an enlisted man, or an officer, or had some rank advancement in the Army, they received a bounty land grant commensurate with their level of service. So if you were an enlisted man, you might get 20 acres or 40 acres. If you were a general, you might get 600 or 800 acres. So it just depended on, and the bounty land records and the pensions, by the way, were adjusted almost yearly by the United States legislature. So basically you got a different deal every time the legislature went into session almost. Not that's a little bit of an overstatement, but not quite. They really did make fiddle around with it, just like they do with the income tax and the state taxes and things like that. So anyway, these bounty lands were given to the soldiers in the form of a warrant. And a warrant is a piece of paper like a contract that says the government will give them a certain amount of land on demand. So they had to present the warrant to what was then established as the General Land Offices, the GLOs, these land offices established by the government. And then they would declare a certain tract of land open to warrants, and then the soldiers could go in and buy the land with their warrant, so they could get as much land as they wanted to. Now, what happened with the land warrants, however, was that a lot of the Revolutionary War soldiers were not interested in moving out into the wilderness again, or ever, and so there were people out there who would say, okay, fine, sell us your land warrants. And these land warrants were in the form of what they call script. So it was a piece of paper that said that they were entitled to this land warrant. And so the speculators would buy up the land warrants, and then they created and essentially what they created was a stock market, a market in land warrants. And the value of these warrants was quoted in the newspaper back and forth in the newspapers of the day. And many people, many of the soldiers converted their land warrants into cash, took the cash and gave the land warrants. Now, this was an interesting phenomena because there are records of this. Every time what I'm talking about here are events that occurred that created a body of records that you can use to trace your ancestors' actions during this time period. Uh, and the interesting thing is to find out that they actually did fight in the war by showing that they received a bounty warrant record, and there's a record of it. Okay, so let's go back through this real quick. Compiled service records is an envelope containing card abstracts taken from muster rolls. Now, muster roll means a person who showed up for duty on any particular day in the Army. Returns, which are the documents that came back from the count of who was ready and how many soldiers and who was available for duty. Pay vouchers, which is obvious, they were what they were paid, and the other records. These records provide you with an ancestor's rank, their unit, the date they were mustered in, meaning the date they joined the Army, the date they were mustered out, which means that the day they departed from completed their term of service, their basic biographical information, medical information, and military information. Obviously, if they were killed during the war or were missing or ran away, left without, AWL, away without leave, and things like that, then those are often noted. All of those kinds of things are noted. So these are your basic records, and these basic records, as I mentioned, are contained primarily in the National Archives, and if they were in a militia, then they are in the individual state records. So the pension records, now let's be specific about these. The pension records are based on service in the armed forces between 1775 up to 1916. So they cover a lot more than just the Revolutionary War. There's pensions that were paid all the way through for service during all of those years. And the pension application files usually provide the most genealogical information and important documents that you can find. So if you're a veteran or his dependents, his wife or children, claimed a pension from the United States government, then these documents would be extremely valuable. What was even more valuable, by the way, is if the government denied the pension for any reason, because the application was incomplete, or because they didn't believe the person had served in the Army, or for whatever bureaucratic or whatever other reason there was for not accepting the order, because then the person making the application for the pension would add even more documents. They would add things like marriage certificates and birth records and death certificates and pages from family Bibles and family letters and depositions, meaning affidavits given by individuals that this person was in the Army, and the affidavits of discharge papers and other kinds of affidavits of just where the person was and why they believed they were in the Army, and discharge papers. Anything that the person could think of that might persuade the government to pay the pension was submitted in these files. So they get to be not just a few pieces of paper in a folder, but they get to be it could be a substantial number of documents, into the hundreds of documents that were sometimes submitted in support of pension applications. So it becomes not just a history of the individual, but it becomes a history of the entire family, and you get information about their children, their spouses, anything that was about that person's life. Now, the bounty land records, as I've already explained pretty much in detail, were for service between 1775 and 1855. Now, so these warrants were given for this kind of situation. Now, let me kind of explain a situation that occurred with a bounty land record here that we worked on. We had a patron come into the Mesa Family Search Library down in Mesa, Arizona, and had a document that he had a question about. He said, "I have a deed up in Davis County, Utah, where my ancestor gets owned a farm in Davis County, which is just north of Salt Lake City, Utah." And he said that showed the deed, and the deed was from somebody to somebody. He had no idea who these people were, and his question was, where did this deed get? How did my grandfather get this property? This deed doesn't even make any sense. Well, so in getting into that, after a few hours of research, we discovered that this was based on a bounty land grant. Now, this deed had been granted back in 1930. Okay, this is not too long ago. I mean, it's a while ago. It's almost 100 years ago, but 1930, and it was a bounty land record, and it turned out to be a bounty land bounty warrant from the War of 1812. So here's what had happened. The warrant had been issued to a soldier in 1812, after the War of 1812, and that soldier had sold it to a land speculator, and that piece of script had passed through hand after hand after hand of person purchasing it until it came to the patron's ancestor, who used that to buy the land instead of selling it for cash. And that purchase with that bounty land warrant was still valid with the United States government. So he got, in essence, a plot of land that he used for a farm. And the names and everything that were on the deed and on the bounty land warrant had nothing at all to do with the ancestor at all. They all had dated back to the War of 1812 and to the people who had owned that bounty land warrant in the intervening time. So basically what I'm saying is that this Revolutionary War concept, I mean, the idea that there are records in the Revolutionary War, we think of, oh, we're going to get records in the Revolutionary War, and we're going to prove that our ancestor was a soldier, and then I'm going to join the DAR, I'm going to join the SAR, or whatever. And the answer is, well, wait a minute, we're going to do a lot of genealogical research, and when we get these records from the war, we're going to find out a whole bunch of really interesting things, and it may even be something that affected our own grandparents, or something that happened even more recently than we can perhaps believe. And so these kinds of things have a tendency to have a greater impact than you would normally think would have happened just because the person fought in the war, which of course was a big deal. Okay, so where are the records? That's really the question here. And hands down, folks, most of these records are sitting in the National Archives. There isn't any other place that has anything close to the number of military records in the National Archives. And we're talking about the National Archives in Washington, D.C., but we're also talking about other National Archive branches throughout the country. And a lot of the military records are kept in the United States Archives, military record archives in St. Louis, Missouri. And a lot of those records were burned. Of course, that does not apply to the Revolutionary War, but there's a lot of records out there in the National Archives. And what else has happened is that Ancestry.com, in partnership with the National Archives, has been digitizing those records, primarily military records, and with Family Search. So we do have a substantial number of bounty land records and pension records, and even in some enlistment records that have been digitized and are available through Ancestry and Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org. Now, Ancestry purchased a company called Footnote.com and changed the name to Fold 3. The Fold 3 name refers to the way that flags are folded following a funeral, a military funeral, and they're into a trifold, so they called it the Fold 3. And the Fold 3 website is probably now the largest single website containing military records available for the United States, far more than the U.S. National Archives has in its own digital records. Only a very, very, very small percentage of the records in the National Archives, I mean, almost a vanishingly small percentage of the records have been digitized. And it is only through primarily through these partner websites that many of these records have been made available. Um, and then there are a lot of Revolutionary War websites out there and a lot of records, local records that have been made available. There are military uh, historical repositories. Some of the larger military bases have have museums and libraries. Some of the naval academies have substantial libraries. Um, I mean, the military academies, not just the naval academy, but the military academies have substantial record repositories. Many of the larger libraries in the colonies, in the original colonies in the New England and the other colonies of the 13 original colonies have additional Revolutionary War records. So you can spend a lot of time online, find a lot of information, but ultimately, if your information is not forthcoming, if you don't find your ancestor uh, by doing some substantial searching online, then the chances are you're going to end up having to go visit one of the major libraries, the National Archives, or one of the other libraries back in the eastern part of the United States, where those records will probably be available. I also suggest you look at your local big libraries. If you have a library in your state, a state library in that, it's always a good idea to go there and start looking for records. Like I said, with that one example about the bounty land warrant, the you never know when those kinds of records are going to turn up and be involved with the Revolutionary War. Of course, you have to understand that if Arizona, Utah, California, all these places didn't exist at the time of the Revolutionary War, it's not likely that you're going to find any original type source records there unless there's just somebody that collected them or somebody had a particular interest and collected those records. So it's very possible, but not something you would normally find. So now you look online, and here's Ancestry's U.S. Revolutionary War rolls from 1775 to 1783. Those are the main years that would be contained in the records. And this is a searchable database, and or you can browse for the records and look through them by regiment or by state. And this is a good way to get started. If you don't have an Ancestry.com subscription, you can probably get access in a larger library. You might check your locals. If you live in a larger city and have a large city library, it's possible they would have free access to Ancestry, but you might have to go to a county library or even a state library. The family history libraries, the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, as well as the over 5,000 family history centers around the world from Family Search also have access to Ancestry, and the library edition in that should let you do research into the U.S. Revolutionary War records. In addition to that, another great ancestry database is the Daughters of the American Revolution lineage books. There's 152 volumes of these books. And the Daughters of the American Revolution for many years have been compiling genealogies of people who are descendants and the descendants of and the connections to Revolutionary War veterans. Um, this is another very valuable source of information. I would be careful of any user contributed information if there aren't documents to support it. You need to have supporting documents to verify that you are a descendant of a Revolutionary War. This is the Daughters of the American Revolution Genealogical Research System. Um, and this is interesting because the Daughters of the American Revolution are not necessarily limiting their membership to veteran soldiers who fought in the war. I mean, we get this concept that the DAR or SAR, Sons of the American Revolution, are looking for people who actually fought in the war. But their definitions, and you go to their website here, the DAR website, and or the SAR website, and look at their requirements for membership and who you need to connect to. And the answer is you can pretty well get into to get a connection to the DAR or the SAR by having a relative who was alive, participating, and involved in commerce during the time of the Revolutionary War. There were all sorts of people, county officials and others, are counted as being supporters of the Revolutionary War. So if you've never considered uh, looking into joining one of these organizations simply because you assumed your ancestor didn't have anything to do with the war and never fought in the war, that may not be a disqualifying factor. You may find out that your ancestor did in fact participate in the war to the extent that would fulfill the requirements of the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of the American Revolution. And here's the U.S. Sons of the American Revolution membership applications, and these are on Ancestry, and their applications from 1889 to 1970. Now, the amount of documentation and what had to be submitted to prove a relationship has become more, let's say, more regularized and more stringent, a little bit stricter in in recent times. Early on, some of the old applications, um, I've not been impressed sometimes with those early applications, but you can always get a hint, and you may find exactly the kind of information that you're looking for by looking at these revolutionary organizations membership applications that are online available. Um, Now, there's other websites out here, and I'm just going to use a couple of examples here. First of all, we have the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution Patriot and Grave Index. This is a big organization that compiled the graves and Patriot lists and things. And this kind of a website with these kinds of that are sponsored by organizations like the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution are valuable because they give us online sources where we can go and find connections. You have to be really careful not to assume that because you found your John Smith listed as a veteran that was that you found a John Smith listed that was your John Smith. That may not be the case. Okay, so here we are back to the National Archives. Now, these records are not going to be online. They're going to be cataloged and available, and they're going to tell you which records are available and where they are in the War Department collection of Revolutionary War records. And this is where most of the records are still residing. They are being digitized, and I would certainly recommend, as I did initially, that you search on the big websites of Ancestry and Family Search and Fold3 before you start getting into other types of records. Okay, so now let's talk about the Hessians. So who were the Hessians? The Hessians were German auxiliary soldiers from Hesse-Kassel who fought for the England during the Revolutionary War. So they weren't, by the way, they were from there in the sense that that was their sponsoring jurisdiction, the people who were involved with it. But they were mercenary soldiers that were hired from various places in Europe. They were primarily, however, German-speaking people, so they were sort of all classified as Germans, even if they weren't really from Germany, because there wasn't a Germany back then in 1700s. There was no such place as Germany. Germany did not exist as a country, and so this is where they came from. Um, they were established soldiers in their national armies, and they were required by their countries to serve. They didn't volunteer to come to America. They were simply soldiers, and if they left, they would be shot for desertion. And so basically, they shipped them over here to America to fight. So that's how they got here. And the person who was in charge of all that was a person by the name of Landgrave Frederick II of Hesse-Kassel. And he was the son-in-law of King George II. So that's how they got involved in shipping, the English got involved in shipping German soldiers over. So how did they get paid? Well, let's tell you, they didn't pay. They didn't get paid that much, but who got paid was the country. So Landgrave Frederick II of Hesse-Kassel was the one who got the benefit out of all this. So he was making money off of his mercenary soldiers because he was getting paid by King George, his father-in-law. The British brought in soldiers from other parts of the Holy Roman Empire as well. Okay, so you can't assume that because you find out that your ancestor was a Hessian soldier, that that person automatically came from Hesse-Kassel, which is a place, a physical place. And I'll show you that in a minute. So they also came from other principalities, other places in the Holy Roman Empire, where they were trying to benefit from providing mercenary soldiers and making some sizable amounts of money from the benefits of these soldiers fighting in America. So they could have come from Brunswick or Ansbach-Bayreuth or Waldeck or Anhalt-Zerbst or also Hesse-Hanau. So there are lots of different places where they can come. By the way, my German, if I ever try to speak German, it's going to have a Spanish accent because I've spoken Spanish all my life. So my German is not going to sound like German. Forget that. It's going to sound like I'm a Spanish speaker speaking German. Okay, so where was Hesse-Kassel? The red part there, the black part that you see is kind of roughly what we recognize as being the Holy Roman Empire at the time, and or Germany. Now that you think you've got the Denmark sitting up there to the north, and it's going up to the North Sea. And this is the central part, and that red part there is what was called Hesse-Kassel. And this was the way it was divided up. If I were to zoom in on it, these are all the little places. And here's the deal. If you want to really find these individuals, you have to get the records that show exactly where they came from on this map and down to the town, so that you can find additional records. Because to find their church records, for example, or to find them and locate them as a soldier who fought in America, as opposed to somebody who was of the same name back in this part of what we now call Germany, is the real trick. And that's where we have to get into some pretty heavy research part. And the Hessians were part of every major battle in the Revolutionary War. So they didn't just appear late on the stream and get defeated by George Washington. They were basically part of the soldiers who won all of those battles that were lost by the colonists over the years. Now, unsurprisingly, not very surprisingly at all, many of those Hessian soldiers decided that when the war was over, that they didn't particularly want to go back to Germany, or to what we would call Germany, back to Europe. So they decided they wanted to stay, and the Americans were pretty, let's not call them forgiving. They weren't necessarily forgiving in that sense, but they were tolerant of having any kind of new people come in. Not more or less, not really, but they did find a place for themselves here in America. And when the troops surrendered, of course, they didn't have any particular benefits that accrued from going back and trying to get back into their country in Europe. Most of them had been professional soldiers and didn't like the idea of having to go back and being under the rule of the German princes again. So they quit. And so only about half of the 19,000 or so German troops went home. And so though many died, the number that they guessed stayed in the United States was approximately 3,500. So there's quite a group, and there's a substantial number of people today in the United States who could trace their genealogy back to one of these Hessian soldiers. And there's the records for many, many years now. This particular website, the AMREV, American Revolution Hessian, is a mailing list website, but it's a record of the Hessian soldiers. And they've been accumulating as many records as they could find about the Hessian soldiers for a considerable period of time. And I have it's on RootsWeb, actually, if you're familiar with that, which is also part of Ancestry, but it's on the free pages.military.rootsweb.ancestry.com, and it's the AMREV Hessians / whatever. Now, when I put up a address like this from a website, and if you happen to be watching this in on YouTube or a recorded version, then you can stop and look at that screen and write it down and go to that website. So, but of course, when you're listening, I have to leave it up for a few seconds. But if you look for records of Hessian soldiers, you're going to find this website in a Google search. And then there's another organization that was interesting that's tried to put together the records of all the Hessian soldiers, and that's the Johannes Schwalm Historical Association, Inc. And once again, if you do a search for Hessian soldiers on Google, you'll come up with this one, and that's their address, their URL, and I won't try to say that. Now, it's important that you keep looking in the usual places. You understand that these people who were basically in the war for a period of time, maybe as little as a couple of weeks or maybe as long as years, lived other lives. I mean, they became civilians again. They went back. They were farmers. They were merchants. They were whatever, and went back to their lives. So we're still going to have to do a lot of research on these people to find them. We just know that there's a possibility that we find additional information or crucial information by looking in the military records. So they were just regular citizens of the United States, and you're still going to look for birth, marriage, death records, church records, school records, all the other kinds of records that might have been in existence. Okay, well, thanks for watching, and appreciate that. This is another BYU Family History Library webinar, and remind everyone that these are uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel at youtube.com. If you do a search, our website's right now looking a little different and weird than it looked recently, but if you just click on the videos links, you'll see all the videos are still there and everything can be watched. Thanks for watching.
Okay, well, thank you very much, James, for the wonderful webinar, and we hope everyone's been able to enjoy this presentation and the history that came with it. We'd love to hear some of your feedback. We've got some pods down at the bottom. Let us know what we can do better, how we can change things, what we can improve, and we'll try to make these webinars as enjoyable and easy to use as possible. So if you ever have any difficulties, let us know, and we'll always try to make the process a little bit simpler. We hope to see you back on Monday for the webinar with Catherine Grant. Thank you.